when suddenly, in the middle of these ruins, they hear this woman make this piercing scream, this total wail that's echoing throughout these ruins.
So once again, you found yourself at the campsite of the Orator. Well, please pull up a chair. As you can see, my fire is stoked, which means tonight I have another tale to tell. But before we begin, if you do find yourself enjoying this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, then please allow the spirits to guide your planchette to both the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell. You'll get notified every time I upload new content, and it allows me to continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. Second, all of my stories are first-hand accounts of the supernatural and paranormal. So, if you or anybody you know has a story that might fit well on my channel, reach out to me in the comments below or on any of my social media. We'll get together, I'll collect your story, and hopefully one day we can feature it here on The Orator. And now, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to today's story. It is a tale that I call Babylon. So our story begins on one of the most tragic days in United States history, September 11th, 2001, a day where a terrorist sect known as Al-Qaeda flew airplanes into the Twin Towers in New York City, along with the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing many great Americans in what most people consider one of the most infamous and worst attacks ever committed on United States soil. In response to this, then United States President George W. Bush decided to go to war in the Middle East with the intent to completely destroy the terrorist sect known as Al-Qaeda. Now, Brian was a sergeant in the Army, and in 2003, he was just being discharged from the Army. Now, this is when the war was just getting started, and so he was just exiting and just able to go home to his wife and kids when all of a sudden we were in an active wartime status. Now, the U.S. military had already been moved over to the Middle East, places like Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Baghdad, stuff like that. They were all over the place over there. And Brian had just returned home. And so he was just getting ready to live a civilian life when all of a sudden they needed more troops over in Iraq. And so Brian decided to deploy as an independent contractor through a company called Halliburton. So he went over after all the other troops were over there. He got paid more money as an independent contractor, and his job was a lot safer than being on the front lines. And so he went to a place called Camp Mabry in Austin, Texas, and from there deployed out to Kuwait in a place called Camp Doha. And so he arrives in Camp Doha in early 2003, and basically Brian's job, like I said, it was not to be on the front lines fighting. His job was actually to transport supplies from Kuwait over to Baghdad. It's about 650 kilometers, over 400 miles between those two places. And so basically, there were these civilian caravans that would carry these supplies, things like water and food and blankets and basic necessities for both civilians and soldiers who were waiting for those supplies in Baghdad. So they would make the over 400-mile trip every single day from Kuwait to Baghdad with new supplies. Now, this trip, even though it was done by civilian caravan, it did need a military escort for a couple of reasons. Number one, they could always take fire from the opposing forces, right? The terrorist sects were out in the desert waiting for these convoys to come through with supplies, and they were always trying to engage and shoot them and stop these supplies from getting delivered. Also, the terrorist sect would plant what are called IEDs. Basically, they're explosive devices all over in the desert along these routes, and if a vehicle hit them, obviously it could kill or injure the people. It would destroy the supplies. These were devastating, and they needed to be found and obviously disarmed. And so those were both problems, but then also 400 miles every single day with multiple vehicles in the desert, these vehicles were bound to break down pretty frequently, especially with the amount of sand the intake was taking in. And so these civilian vehicles that were transporting all these materials, they needed a military escort to protect them, and they needed their mechanics to be able to fix the vehicles if things broke down. And so that was basically Brian's daily task, transporting supplies the 400 miles. It would take all day for them to get from Kuwait all the way to Baghdad, and then once they were there, they'd drop off their supplies, and then that day, they would turn around and make the trip back basically at night. Now, Brian specifically, because of his military experience, he was an SAW gunner. His job was to sit on top of the vehicle with one of these big rail guns and look out for opposing forces. And if they did have to engage outside of the vehicle, he could detach his gun and literally go down on the ground and engage that way. And so basically that was his job, was to actively protect the people with his gun. So it's their normal trip. They're traveling from Kuwait to Baghdad, and they are on their normal route when all of a sudden they enter a place called Camp Babylon. Now, Camp Babylon, it is always along their route, so they pass through this place quite often. Nowadays, it's an excavation site. There's a lot of countries that visit that place and are excavating and looking for stuff because, as the name might imply, Camp Babylon sits on the ruins of the city of Babylon, a city that existed over 4,000 years ago and was one of these ancient, awesome wonders. And you could still see the ruins of these wonders today, these giant old pillars that are obviously broken and have been eroded by the sand and wind and stuff like that. And so there's this ancient city out there that is, obviously mostly buried, and there's only these small components and stuff, but you can clearly tell that there was a civilization here. And so they're traveling through that area, right, Camp Babylon, when all of a sudden they start taking enemy fire. Now, the military protocol at this time when they took enemy fire was actually to stop the vehicles, have all of the soldiers get out, and return fire from the ground. The reason they did this was because the terrorists were not shooting to actually hit anybody or break anything. What they would do was they would shoot at the vehicles, so the vehicles would steer away from their fire into these IEDs, into these improvised explosives. So they would literally set up these explosives along the way, and then they would try to shoot at the incoming vehicles to drive them into the explosives. And then when the military realized that that was the terrorist strategy, they decided, obviously, we're not going to keep driving and fall into their plan. Let's stop. We'll have our soldiers who are actually fighting get out and set up a perimeter and return fire, and our engineers will go out and scout for these IEDs, these bombs, find them, disarm them, and then we can get along safely. And so they start taking fire, and that's exactly what they did. All of the armed infantry got out, they set up a perimeter, and they start immediately returning fire as safely as they can, and the engineers get out and they go searching for these bombs. And immediately, as soon as the Army gets out, the U.S. Army gets out and sets up a perimeter and starts returning fire, the terrorists flee immediately. Because, like I said, their job is not to try to fight United States military who are better equipped. There are more of them. They're better trained. It was not to try to do that. It was just to try to steal the vehicles into these bombs. And so as soon as they realized that did not happen, they flee. And now Brian and the rest of the soldiers are just there, set up as a perimeter, watching the desert in case something happens. And as they're sitting there watching and these engineers are out looking for these bombs, they all of a sudden start seeing hundreds of these little shadows running around the ancient ruins of the city of Babylon. And at first they're, a little scared because maybe it's like an incoming force or something like that. But then all of a sudden it's sort of starting to dawn on them that that's not what this is at all. These shadows are too little to be a person, and they're not attached to anything. There's nothing casting the shadow. It's literally just these shadows, maybe like 2-3 feet tall, darting around these ruins. And there's hundreds of them. And it's literally the desert in the middle of the day. There's nowhere to hide. And yet they're seeing these tiny shadows. And they're all sort of looking at each other, confirming like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And they're all very confused by this. And they're a little scared because this is not like anything they've ever seen before. And they're used to fighting, physical troops or something like that. And they're very worried. What do you do against something like this? And so they're freaked out, but they have their perimeter set up and they're ready for anything. But the engineers say, hey, we figured everything out. We are good to go. Bombs are disabled. Let's get back in the vehicles and take off. So they all get back in and they start heading towards Baghdad to deliver their supplies. And once they get in the vehicle, they're obviously talking about, did you see these shadows? And that was really weird. And, what could it be? And they're kind of all throwing out these theories. And one of the guys was a little more into the supernatural and occult. And he was just very frank. He said, guys, don't try to explain it. There is no logical explanation. That city's over 4,000 years old. There were, hundreds of thousands of people used to live in the city of Babylon over time. obviously you're going to see spirits and stuff like that. That's what we saw. We just saw some weird stuff that can't be explained. And while everybody thought he was a little bit of the weirdo and like, yeah, okay, yeah, right, they all sort of were like, they didn't have a better explanation. So even though, most of the other people didn't believe in that kind of stuff, nobody really knew what it was. And so they obviously deliver their stuff to Baghdad. They turn around, they head back, they pass through Camp Babylon, no incident. And after a little while, it's kind of just forgotten because it's wartime and they deal with weird stuff every single day. About a week goes by with no further incidents. Every single day they load up, they head their supplies to Baghdad, they turn around and come back. No issues whatsoever. Until about a week later, they go all the way to Baghdad, they deliver their supplies, they turn around, now they're heading back to Camp Doha in Kuwait, and it is the middle of the night, and their vehicle breaks down. And where does it break down? Right in the middle of Camp Babylon. And right away, all of the soldiers, Brian's looking around, and he realizes they're all sort of like on edge because this is a 400-plus mile journey. And of all the places to break down, right in the middle of this small section of Camp Babylon, it was just so bizarre, especially with the weird thing happening a week before. And so, as is the protocol, all the soldiers get down off the vehicles. They set up a perimeter just in case something happens while they're trying to get the vehicles fixed. The mechanics get down, and they're searching the vehicle and trying to figure out if they can fix it and everything like that. And so, that's kind of where they're set up. It's the middle of the night in the middle of the desert. So, it is super, super dark. There's no sources of light other than their vehicles, and that's pretty much it. When all of a sudden, out in the ruins, they see this big ball of light, maybe a little bit bigger than like a basketball, floating throughout the ruins. And it's just one ball of light, but it's very obvious in the pitch black of this desert what's going on. And it's sort of illuminating. It's clearly casting a glow. They can see the stuff around it. But as they're looking at it, they're realizing it's not a flashlight. It's not from anything. There's nothing holding it. It's not a person out there with some sort of light. This is just a light by itself, independent, floating around. And they're all obviously really weirded out by this. So they pop on their night vision goggles. So now instead of it being night, they can see almost as clear as day. And they're watching this floating orb of light just sort of floating around out in these ruins. And it's not that far away, a couple 100 yards away, but it's very, very obvious what's going on. And so they're all very weirded out. And then they decide, you know what, doesn't matter. Let's get back in the vehicles. Now that they're fixed, we'll go. And even though it's weird, it's none of our business. And so the vehicles are fixed. They all turn to go get back in the vehicle when suddenly, in the middle of these ruins, they hear this woman make this piercing scream, this total wail that's echoing throughout these ruins. And Brian, later, he would say, it was the scariest scream I've ever heard. He said, I've been in active war where people were screaming for their lives. He said, I never heard somebody so just totally miserable and in danger, and it was just the saddest, loneliest, scariest scream he said he's ever heard. It sent shivers down his spine. And so they hear this scream, and they're soldiers, so they're thinking, maybe, we need to maybe do something, help somebody, protect somebody. And so in addition to their night vision goggles, they take out their giant flashlights, and they click those on, and now they have these big beams of light cast, and you can see everything. Every small detail in these ruins, they could see it like it's clearer than day out with their night vision goggles coupled with their flashlights. And so they're looking everywhere for this lady, and they can't see anything. There are no people out there at all. The orb of light that was floating out there is just gone. And so they don't know what to do. They're not going to go and explore these ruins. It's not their job. And what if it's some sort of trap or something like that? And so even though they're all really freaked out by this, they decide to get back in their vehicle and head home. And so they all turn, they go to get back in their vehicle, when Brian suddenly realizes one of the troops is not going back. He's standing and staring off, and he's not just staring into the ruins. He has this look of total petrified fear on his face, like end times fear. And so Brian kind of shakes him. He's like, hey, what's up? And he's looking at what the guy's looking at, trying to see if maybe there's something out there. Maybe he spotted the woman or something like that. He's got his flashlight and he's looking, and there's nothing. He sees the ruins. That's it. It's completely empty. There's nothing out there at all. And he's shaking his friend. He's, hey, what's going on? Hello, hello. And his friend is totally unresponsive, but just white as a ghost, terrified. And eventually, at some point, Brian's like, I don't know what he's seeing. I don't know what's going on, but we got to go. It's like literally grabs his friend along with one of the other soldiers, and they literally help him back into the vehicle, get him inside, sit him down, and then they head out. And everybody, obviously this guy's freaked out and he's not really talking, but everybody else is, going over, what did you see? What was this ball of light? What was that scream? They're so engaged in this conversation that they sort of forget about the guy who sort of went comatose. And the whole way back, they're positing theories, and now they're talking about those weird shadows again, and they're trying to piece things together, and they're all really freaked out. And they finally get back to Camp Doha in Kuwait, and Brian suddenly remembers, oh yeah, that dude was, comatose. And so he goes to talk to him, and the guy is now lucid, and he's there, and he says, hey man, what the hell happened to you in the desert? Like, we were all getting ready to leave. You were freaked out. And he said, I saw this thing in the desert. He said it was like 10 feet tall, and it was staring at me. And he said it was like the shape of a man, but it was so big. And he said, I just knew we were all going to die. He said, I felt scared before, but I wasn't scared that we were going to. I knew. He said, I've never felt so much dread in my life, but I knew that thing was going to kill us. I knew we were going to die. And he said, and then suddenly I woke up, and we were almost back here. He said, I don't remember getting in the vehicle or getting put in the vehicle. I don't remember the ride home. I don't remember really anything other than I saw him. I thought for sure we were going to die, and then I blacked out and then woke up here. And this is a hardened, battle-worn soldier who has literally looked life and death in the face multiple times in wartime. And he said that it was so terrifying that it literally made him pass out. And so Brian, he takes this information, he goes back, and they're discussing stuff. Nobody can come up with any kind of reasonable answer. And at the end of the day, they are soldiers with a job to do. And so they get everything ready, they go to bed, they wake up the next day, and they make the same trek again. And luckily, over the next couple months, even though they made that same trip hundreds of times between Kuwait and Baghdad, even though they went through those ruins of Babylon hundreds of times, luckily, none of the other soldiers ever saw anything supernatural from that place again. And so that's going to do it for today's story. If you did find yourself enjoying this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural and paranormal, things that go bump in the night, then please allow the spirits to guide your planchette to both the like and subscribe button, and then click that notification bell as well so you get notified every time I upload new content, and I can continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. And then second, all of my stories are first-hand accounts of the supernatural and paranormal, so if you or maybe somebody you know has a story that would work really well on this page, you can comment below, you can reach out to me on any of my social medias, and we will collect your story and hopefully feature it one day here on The Orator. And so, until next time, where you will pull up your chair, my fire will be stoked, and I will have another tale to tell.